In the autumn of 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army sets its expansionist gaze on the impregnable British colony of Singapore. It was a key component in Japan's quest for control of the Pacific. For the British, it was a defeat as great as Pearl Harbor. Albert Adams was a private in the British infantry. This is where he met the enemy, on the battlefront. Until late 1941, the British are fighting a war against the Germans at their doorstep. But a new offensive is about to take place at a more distant location in the British Empire. October 1941. Japan completes final preparations for war. A prime objective is Malaya because of its rich natural resources of rubber. But to take Malaya, Japan must also conquer Singapore, the most heavily armed fortress in the world. For more than 100 years, Great Britain has dominated Singapore. British military experts have long believed that any invasion of Singapore would come from the sea. The world's largest fixed long-range guns guard the south, east and west approaches to the island from attack. Army Commander General Sir Arthur Percival anticipates enemy landings at beaches in Siam and northern Malaya, then a drive down the peninsula to Singapore. To prevent this, the English adopt a new defense plan called Matador, in which British troops would be moved across Siam to defend the beaches against a Japanese invasion force. The British troop movement would require 24 hours. Percival is told to prepare, but receives no orders to move. December the 7th, 1941. 2 hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the war in the Pacific begins. Japanese troops, under the leadership of General Yamashita, are to land at the same beaches that Percival wanted to defend in Plan Matador. 3 of the toughest divisions in the Imperial Army make up the invasion force.
The 25th Army that invaded Singapore was one of the best trained forces that the Japanese Army had. They'd been trained in jungle warfare, they'd prepared for this, they'd even done something unusual for an army, certainly, to rehearse amphibious landings. So this was a crack force. One landing was actually in Malaya, and they expected to meet resistance, but they didn't.
British troops are unable to reach the beaches in time to stop the invasion. Japanese planes make their first airstrikes from bases in occupied Indochina. Four hours after the first invasion wave, Singapore is bombed. The British have no idea how many Japanese soldiers have landed. Rumors circulate numbers in the hundreds of thousands. Making the situation worse, enemy planes not only surprise the British forces, but demoralize them as well, because there are no RAF fighters in the air. The British have less than 200 planes in Malaya, and most of them are obsolete. The few that get off the ground are no match for the highly maneuverable Zero fighters. Only 50 British planes survive the attack. Within 24 hours, the air over Malaya and Singapore is controlled by the Japanese. On December the 10th, 97 Japanese planes attack the only 2 large Navy ships in the Far East. Without RAF protection, the ships are caught in an unavoidable crossfire of torpedoes. The battleship Prince of Wales and the cruiser Repulse are sunk, taking 840 men with them, including Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Navy in Singapore. This battle would affect the future strategy of war. For the first time in history, battleships underway at sea are sunk from the air. The Japanese have once again rewritten the rules of war at sea. The blow to British morale is tremendous. The one naval force which could have come to the rescue of the British is in ruins. The United States Pacific Fleet is still reeling from the 2-hour surprise attack at Pearl Harbor just 3 days earlier. With the Japanese making more aggressive moves in the Pacific, British reinforcements are increased in Singapore. Albert Adams is a private in the British infantry.
We was going to the Middle East, actually, and after Pearl Harbor, we diverted to India because we had to be rigged out again with tropical gear. We arrived in Singapore. Oh, it was a marvellous place. The climate and everything is perfect. I think that's why most of them survived, because of the climate, etc. Actually, I think a lot of the reason why we went was actually because most of the civilian population wouldn't leave because they thought it's impregnable. The island, they thought, no, I'd never surrender or anything like that, so they didn't trouble.
The British soldiers are unconcerned about the Japanese making their way down Malaya. They consider themselves a better trained, better equipped army. With complete air superiority, Japanese ground forces now push down the Malay Peninsula by whatever means possible.
They didn't have a lot of gasoline-powered vehicles, so they had done a lot of intelligence work, and you could use bicycles, an unexpected weapon, move along, keep people moving. Malaya had relatively few cities. The area where they actually landed were just small port towns. It's not like the Philippines, where you've got a Manila where potentially you could have had a big urban battle. There was, relatively speaking, little resistance because the British kept pulling back. And of course, that was all the advantage of the Japanese.
Ironically, the British have engineered the roads so well, the Japanese advance with extra speed. Demolition tactics fail to stop the infantry on bicycles. Special construction units rush in to repair bridges for the tanks and trucks to follow.
The Japanese have a saying, a sort of parable about themselves, particularly males. The symbol is the carp, and the carp swims upstream against all obstacles. If he hits an obstacle, he just keeps trying. I think there was a carp-like quality to the Japanese advance in Malaya. Meet an obstacle, fight it. If the British are blowing things up, bring in Korean laborers or whoever to reconstruct the roads at night and then move your troops along rapidly as you can. Just keep going. That was one of the things, I think, which surprised the British, the intensity and the determination with which the Japanese continued this advance.
The Japanese battle plan calls for victory in 100 days. But in less than 30 days, the Japanese push the British halfway down the coast of Malaya. By January the 7th, the front lines are within 250 miles of Singapore.
The individual Japanese soldier certainly would have had a certain degree of apprehension about going up against the British, even though there's propaganda about how the colonialists are corrupt and weak. But then to see this thing succeed, to have it go as well as it did, as fast as it did, would have been amazing. There would have been a sense of elation, as well as a sense, always remember, this is battle.
The speed of the Japanese advance catches the British completely off guard. English regiments are in disarray. Untrained in jungle warfare, they are ordered to delay the Japanese as long as possible. They must destroy anything that can be used by the enemy, and then retreat. Since British military experts believe that tank fighting in thick jungle terrain would be useless, there's not a single Allied tank in all of Malaya. That leaves no logistical way to hold off a large invading tank force.
We moved up to Adam Estate. We had plenty of ammunition. In 2 days, you can't run out really, can you, if you've got adequate supplies for 2 days. I'm a sniper. Up a coconut tree, He saw one of my mates' best friends. Bullet straight through the forehead. I saw him up there. We shot him down, and he had a mask made out of a coconut.
The Japanese constantly outflanked the British lines with their skilled jungle fighting. By the end of January 1942, all hope of holding the Malay Peninsula has evaporated. The British are ordered to withdraw to the stronghold of Singapore. On January the 31st, the British troops complete their withdrawal into Singapore. Behind them, the causeway connecting the island to the mainland is blown up to prevent any Japanese invasion.
They would never, take it. Well, it's obvious, wasn't it? All that naval guns they had situated on the coast. We saw about 3 Japanese planes while we were there. Dropped about 3 bombs, and that was it. And they looked like old training planes, nothing special about them.
However, one of the mainstays of a defense, air power, is lacking in Singapore.
They had loads of planes sent in crates. They weren't even assembled. Spitfires and Hurricanes, but they weren't assembled at all.
British troops who have just arrived in Singapore are given orders to start digging defense positions. The fact that this is being done with the Japanese at their doorstep is a result of British overconfidence in their ability to hold Singapore. Singapore's defences to the south are strong, but there's still a vulnerable opening in the north which has never been closed. The giant guns cannot be used for protection. General Percival spreads his men along the beaches, hoping to prevent the Japanese from getting a foothold on the island. Only 2,500 men protect the narrowest point of the strait. Here, in small boats, 4,000 Japanese are getting ready to attack. February the 8th, 1942, Japanese General Yamashita decides to invade Singapore. With his supplies running out and his men outnumbered 3 to 1, his only hope is to force the British into a quick surrender.
Yamashita seized the heights in Johor, which is on the mainland of Malaysia opposite the island of Singapore. They set fire to oil tanks, the naval base. They had the artillery advantage. They could create a lot of noise. They had command of the air. They were dropping bombs, and so the spirits of the Japanese troops must have been, after this amazing, rapid advance on the city, terrifically high as they prepared for the climactic moment of seizing the city itself.
The Japanese send up an observation balloon to direct their artillery fire. The British have no planes to knock it down.
What Yamashita did that was surprising was to go around and have an amphibious force land on the western side of Singapore Island at the same time the British had planned for a different battle. The big guns, the place to protect was the naval base at Singapore, but the guns were pointing out to sea, not to the north, from the direction from which the Japanese would advance. And with the advantage of controlling the airfields on the Malayan mainland, continue bombing the city to disrupt the morale of the people in the city, making them more willing to surrender.
The Japanese drive a deep wedge into the British lines, forcing them to retreat. Soon the entire city is within the range of the Japanese artillery. Within 5 days, the Japanese capture the reservoirs and cut off the city's water supply.
General Yamashita wanted to take the city of Singapore without a fight because he knew that his troops were inferior in number to the defenders. And so the first thing they did was have planes fly over that dropped literally boxes that contained appeals to surrender, basically saying there's no reason to have a battle in which we're going to kill a lot of civilians. You should give up to save the women and children that are in the city. If you don't, I will order an annihilation attack on the city of Singapore. 3 days later, a warning, you'd better come to meet me to talk about surrender terms, or else.
Churchill orders his generals to defend Singapore to the death. Surrender, he says, is out of the question.
We've never had enough time to be worried or anything like that. No sooner got there and there was, walls in the firing line, but it only lasted for a couple of days. I think it took about 5 days for the car to come from the top of Malaya to Singapore, and the Japs done it in 3.
Under attack for several days, the British are finally beginning to realize the depth of Japanese penetration into their defenses.
All the guns, etc., were pointing out to sea, and the Japs coming at the back, and therefore they couldn't reverse the guns. The trouble was they were being cut off, you see. Actually, as we were supposed to be fighting the front line, another wave came to the back of them, of troops, and actually they had no chance at all.
Finally, the British commanders agree that with the water supply nearly gone, short on food, fuel, and their troops exhausted, counterattack is impossible.
Everything, all the service and everything was on the Malayan mainland. And that's one reason they were cut off for water and everything, the people were. But when it stopped, well, actually it was glad it was over in one way, because it was over and done with.
It's got to be one of the most unusual encounters ever. It was held in a bank. And an old-fashioned bank, they had a cage like for the tellers to be in, when people had the money. They met inside this cage to talk and negotiate the surrender. General Percival thought he could buy a little time, and Yamashita just wouldn't hear that. You got to surrender. You can have only 1,000 men who have any kind of arms. You've got to surrender as hostages to maintaining the terms of the surrender. The Governor General of Singapore, plus all of the high command of the British Armed Forces. General Yamashita must have regarded this whole operation as a colossal gamble. The British have a superior number of troops. He doesn't. He's low on ammunition. Can he make this face-to-face encounter work? And he did.
Yamashita tells Percival to say nothing except yes or no. The answer is yes. On February the 15th, 1942, Singapore falls to the Japanese.
It's 130,000 prisoners of war. A significant number of them were sent north as forced laborers to help build the railway from Thailand into Burma, the infamous bridge on the River Kwai. They linger in memory in Australia because of the belief there that the British High Command didn't do all that it could have done to keep them from becoming prisoners.
Well, I was a bit concerned what would happen, and everything for the future. Of course, your parents too, that's what you think of it most. We just took it for granted as prisoners of war, and that was it. You can expect anything,
Instead of the traditional victory parade, Yamashita orders his men to pass through the city in silence, carrying boxes containing ashes of the dead.
I think the best way to sum up what the victory at Singapore meant to the Japanese people, army, everybody involved, is the name they gave the city. When they captured the city, they renamed it Shonan. Sho is the character, the first syllable for the first part of the emperor's formal name, Showa. It means enlightened. Nan is the word for south. So this was the Japanese liberators coming to enlighten and free the city of Singapore from its British colonial oppressors. It means that the Japanese have a base of operations from which they can conduct all kinds of operations, intelligence operations, military operations, naval operations in Southeast Asia. It's a sense, again, of tremendous pride to have done this, a terrific boost to morale at home.
The campaign to take Malaya and Singapore will cost the Japanese over 3,500 dead and over 6,000 wounded. The 130,000 prisoners of war would be subjected to appalling cruelty and inhumanity by their captors, a constant reminder of the fall of Singapore. The British spent nearly 20 years building the fortress of Singapore. The Japanese conquered it in 70 days. At this point, it looks like the Japanese are assured of victory in the war. But the British fighting spirit will be buoyed in the coming months by the rebuilt American Navy and a push to retake the Pacific.